In the bitter January of 1882, while other homesteaders stared at empty root cellars, Elizabeth Cole gathered every mirror she could find, cracked, broken, tarnished, and nailed them to the wall opposite her south window. She angled each one with a surveyor's care, not for vanity, but to catch the pale winter sun. What secret did those mirrors hold? And what would the traveling photographer discover when he stepped inside? She had arrived on this frozen frontier with nothing but a handful of seeds and a husband who had already lost hope. The other women resigned themselves to months without fresh greens, waiting for June. But Elizabeth believed that winter sun, doubled and bent, could fool a tomato vine into thinking it was still July. Her neighbors laughed. They hadn't yet seen what was happening behind that wall of mirrors. And they certainly didn't know that a traveling photographer, Henry Cole, no relation, was about to knock on her door and see not a garden, but a winter portrait studio, one that would turn the darkest months into profit. Elizabeth Cole had learned the hard way that winter on the northern plains was not a season. It was a slow, grinding starvation. By January, most families had already eaten the last of their dried beans and were scraping the bottom of the flour barrel twice a week just to make it stretch. Fresh vegetables were a memory of a life left behind. Scurvy was common. Children grew thin. And the women who were supposed to keep everyone fed knew a truth the men rarely spoke aloud. The long, dark months killed just as surely as a blizzard, only slower. But Elizabeth had come from a different life. Back in Ohio, she had worked beside her father in his glass house, a strange little building made of salvaged window sashes where he grew oranges in January and sold them to riverboat captains for a fortune. She remembered the way sunlight poured through those panes, how even the coldest days felt almost warm inside that humid, green-smelling space. When her husband Thomas finally gave up on Pennsylvania soil and dragged them out to Dakota Territory in search of cheap land, she carried that memory with her. And she carried seeds. Tomato, cucumber, pepper, packed in brown paper twists inside a tin box that never left her apron pocket. Their claim sat on a low rise just north of a settlement so small it had no name yet, only a post office and a wagon trail that turned to mud soup every spring. The cabin was raw. One south-facing window, thin plank walls that let the wind whistle through like it on the place. Thomas spent the first year breaking sod and the second year watching the grasshoppers eat everything green by July. By their third winter, the hope had gone out of him. He sat by the stove most days and stared at the wall while Elizabeth darned socks and tried not to think about the garden that had failed them twice already. But she couldn't stop thinking. The south window let in maybe 3 hours of pale, thin sunlight each day. Not enough to warm a room, let alone grow anything. Yet every time the sun did break through, she noticed how a single pane of glass could turn a cold beam into a faint patch of heat on the floor. Her father had called it trapping the sun. He had traded for every spare window sash within 50 miles, building his glass house piece by piece from the discards of others. Elizabeth did not have window sashes. What she had was a looking glass she had brought from Ohio, a small oval mirror with a crack through its center, the only vanity she had ever owned. One afternoon in late November, she held it flat against the wall opposite the south window and tilted it. A square of light shot across the room and struck the far corner like a thrown blade. That was the moment her neighbors would later remember with headshakes and whispered jokes. Because from that day forward, Elizabeth Cole began collecting mirrors. She traded 2 jars of preserved plums for a chipped glass from a settler's wife. She found a broken shaving mirror in the mud behind the trading post and mended its frame with twine. She bartered a day's sewing for a polished tin sheet that reflected almost as well as silvered glass. Every scrap of brightness she could find, she nailed or hung or propped against the wall opposite that single south window. By Christmas, half the wall was a jumble of reflective surfaces angled at different degrees, some catching the morning sun, some the weak afternoon light, some standing in reserve for the hour when the sun would climb higher in February. The neighbors laughed openly. Margaret Hargrave, the storekeeper's wife, called it Elizabeth's Hall of Vanity and said loud enough for the whole settlement to hear that a woman who spent her winter staring at mirrors was no better than a fool. "She'll be growing peacocks next," someone snickered. Thomas refused to look at the wall. He said nothing, but his silence was worse than their jokes. He believed she was dragging his name through the mud while he sat helplessly by. But Elizabeth kept hanging mirrors. The caramel-colored stray dog she fed each night, the one the children called Buttons, followed her everywhere, tail wagging, as if even he understood that something important was happening inside that cabin. Then, just after New Year's, she planted the first seeds. Not outside in the frozen earth, but inside wooden crates she had scavenged from the freight depot. She filled them with soil she had stored in the root cellar since October, mixed with a little rotted manure, and placed them directly in the path of the doubled sunlight. The combined reflection was strong enough that she had to squint when she stood in the brightest spot. And for the first week, nothing happened. Then green shoots broke the surface, thin, pale, but unmistakably alive. Elizabeth knelt on the cold floor and touched the tiny leaves with her fingertip, barely breathing. January was still outside, howling through the gaps in the wall. And yet here, a living thing was reaching toward the light as if summer had never left. But the frontier had a way of punishing hope. One morning in the third week, Elizabeth woke to find half of her seedlings limp and scorched. The mirrors, perfectly aligned the day before, had shifted slightly overnight, probably from the cabin settling, and now the combined light was burning the tender leaves like a magnifying glass. She had created a death trap instead of a garden. Margaret Hargrave, hearing the news, remarked that God never intended for plants to grow in winter, and this was his way of showing it. Elizabeth did not answer. She spent the rest of that day repositioning every reflective surface, using a piece of frosted glass salvaged from a broken lantern to diffuse the harshest beams. She studied the sun's path across the room, marking the shifting pools of light with bits of string on the floor. She was not just growing plants now. She was engineering a climate in miniature, and she was running out of time. If the remaining seedlings died, there would be nothing to replant until spring, and spring was still 3 months away. What she didn't know was that her greatest test was coming not from the sun or the cold or the sharp tongues of the settlement. It was coming from the wagon trail outside, where a man named Henry Cole was about to knock on her door and change everything. He was a traveling photographer, a portrait man with a heavy plate camera and a desperate need for winter light. And when he stepped inside her cabin and saw the tomato vines already heavy with small green fruit, in February, he would realize that this strange woman with the mirrors had not just grown a garden. She had built the only reliably lit portrait studio within 100 miles, in a season when every other photographer had shut his doors. The storm that might have starved her family was about to become their first real profit. Henry Cole was not a farmer. He was a man who had bet his entire future on the peculiar belief that even the poorest settlers in Dakota Territory would pay good money to see themselves frozen in silver and glass. He traveled with a heavy wooden camera, a crate of polished plates, and a dark tent that smelled of ether and collodion. In summer, he did well. The long days gave him bright, even light, and families lined up in their Sunday clothes to sit stiffly before his lens. But in winter, his business collapsed entirely. The sun hung low and weak, windows barely admitted enough light for an exposure, and the bitter cold froze his chemicals before a single plate could be developed. Every year, Henry spent the dark months nearly broke, waiting for spring like a man watching his savings melt with the snow. This winter had been worse than any before. He had only 3 portraits left in his order book when his wagon crested the low rise north of the settlement. He was heading toward the cluster of cabins when a sharp glint caught his eye. Not the ordinary reflection of snow, but a focused beam shooting from a south-facing window. It was so bright he flinched. He pulled up his mule and stared. Across the frozen field, a small cabin seemed to be throwing light back at the sky like a signal fire made of mirrors. Curiosity, not hope, pulled him closer. And when he opened the door, he stopped breathing for a moment. The interior blazed. The wall opposite the window was a patchwork of reflecting surfaces, cracked-looking glasses, polished tin, a small oval mirror, all angled to funnel the pale February sun into a single concentrated flood. And in that flood, arranged on wooden crates, stood rows of tomato vines heavy with green fruit, cucumber tendrils curling up twine, pepper plants already showing tiny white buds. The air smelled of damp earth and growing things, as if a piece of July had been smuggled inside and hidden from the winter. Buttons, the caramel dog, lay sprawled in the warmest patch of light, barely opening an eye at the stranger. Henry Cole did not see a garden. He saw a studio. The light was even, indirect, and stronger than any indoor winter light he had ever worked with. He had spent years cursing the dimness of January kitchens and the flicker of candle-lit parlors. Here was a room filled with steady, usable brightness. He set down his camera case with a thump. "Ma'am," he said, "I have a proposition." Elizabeth was not easily impressed by strangers, but when the man unpacked his plate camera and showed her the first test exposure he made in her cabin, a photograph of those tomato vines, so sharp she could count the hairs on the leaves, she understood what he was offering. Her mirrors were not just growing vegetables, they were growing light. And light, in a winter-bound territory where every other photographer had shuttered his windows, was worth more than flour. It took precisely 4 days for the first paying customer to arrive. A young couple, the Mercers, had ridden half a day through slushy snow because their infant son was sick with fever, and they feared he would not see spring. They wanted a likeness. Henry set up his tripod in the center of the reflected glow, while Elizabeth hung a woven blanket behind them as a backdrop. The exposure lasted 15 seconds, an eternity for a restless mother, but the light held steady. When the plate came out of the dark tent, clear and distinct, the Mercers wept. Word spread faster than a prairie fire. Soon, families appeared from homesteads so remote that Elizabeth had never even heard their names. They brought eggs, salt pork, or a few precious silver coins to trade for a portrait. Henry and Elizabeth worked as a seamless pair. She managed the customers, the appointments, the careful angles of the mirrors that needed constant adjustment as the sun climbed higher each week. He handled the camera and the developing tent. The profits, split evenly, began to fill a small metal box that Elizabeth hid behind a loose floorboard. The tomatoes ripened. Red fruit in February. That, too, became a spectacle. Margaret Hargrave, who had first mocked the Hall of Vanity, now stood at the door with her arms crossed, refusing to enter but unable to look away. She watched men and women she had known for years file into that cabin and emerge not just with a tin-framed portrait, but with a handful of fresh tomatoes wrapped in brown paper. Elizabeth never charged for the tomatoes. She gave them away. And that simple act of generosity did more damage to the gossip than any argument could have. But there was another problem growing inside the cabin that no mirror could solve. Thomas, her husband, had watched the transformation in sullen silence. First the mirrors, which he had tolerated as harmless eccentricity. Then the plants, which he had ignored. Now the strangers, the money, the strange photographer who spent more time in his home than he did. Profits were real, but the shame of a wife who had become a businesswoman, a woman who worked alongside another man while he sat by the stove, that shame was beginning to curdle into something darker. One evening after the last customer had left, Thomas stood up and looked at the box behind the floorboard. "That money belongs to this household," he said, his voice thick. Elizabeth did not look up from the tomato vines she was pruning. "It does," she replied, "and I am the one who made it." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press against the walls. Then 2 days later the light turned traitor. A February thaw brought a sudden shift in the sun's angle, and the mirrors that had worked for weeks suddenly threw hard, harsh shadows across the portrait space. The first plate Henry developed that morning was ruined. A second, equally bad. He adjusted the mirrors, swore under his breath, tried again. Still no use. Customers were arriving the next day. If they could not produce a clean image, the reputation they had built would crumble overnight. It was Elizabeth who remembered the frosted glass. The same piece of broken lantern she had used to save her seedlings from burning had been tucked away in the corner. She retrieved it and held it between the mirrors and the subject, diffusing the light into a soft, even glow. The next plate came out nearly perfect. Henry stared at her. "You think like a photographer," he said quietly. She did not. She thought like a plant trying to survive in a hostile climate. And plants, she had learned, never argued with the sun. They simply found a way to work with what it gave them. By late February, the partnership had settled into a rhythm. The tomatoes were a reliable draw. The portraits were sharp. The money box grew heavier, but winter was not finished with them. On the last day of the month, the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the wind dropped to a dead stillness. Elizabeth recognized that silence from years past. It was the held breath before a plains blizzard. And this time, the storm would not just test whether a few saplings could stand against the wind. It would test whether a wall of fragile glass and all the hope pinned to it could survive a direct assault of ice and darkness. If those mirrors shattered, the garden would die, the studio would go dark, and the woman who had dared to bend winter to her will would be left with nothing but the bitter laughter of everyone who had ever doubted her. The blizzard arrived just after midnight, not with a gradual rise in wind, but with a single violent slam that shook the cabin like a giant hand had struck it. Elizabeth woke in the dark, her heart already pounding before her mind had fully surfaced. The south window rattled in its frame. Ice pellets struck the glass like thrown gravel, and then she heard the tinkling sound she had dreaded since the day she hung the first mirror. The silver-backed glass in the largest looking-glass she owned had cracked from edge to edge under the pressure of the wind. She was out of bed before Thomas could stir, her bare feet hitting the frozen floor. In the dim glow of the dying stove coals, she saw the damage, a jagged fracture running through the center of her best reflector. The mirror still held its frame, but if the storm continued hammering the window, the glass would blow inward. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket and pressed it against the window, wedging it between the sash and the frame to absorb the shock. Henry, who had been sleeping in the lean-to they'd rigged for his dark tent, stumbled inside, eyes wide. "The light," he said, a statement and a question all at once. Without that mirror wall, the studio was dead. Without the studio, the winter income was dead. And without the vegetables, their best source of fresh food was dead. The storm raged for 2 days. During the worst of it, the wind drove so hard against the south-facing wall that the cabin groaned like a ship at sea. Elizabeth and Henry worked in shifts, bracing the mirrors with whatever they could find: wooden stakes, folded cloth, the iron pot from the stove. The frosted glass diffuser she had salvaged earlier proved to be a crucial buffer. It was already shattered, so it could not be destroyed further. They angled it to break the pressure waves before they reached the fragile silvered surfaces. The tomato vines shivered but held, their leaves trembling under the occasional cold draft. The dog Buttons had wedged himself beneath the plant crates, whimpering only when the loudest gusts hit. Thomas, meanwhile, did not help. He sat by the stove, feeding it logs with a mechanical rhythm, his face unreadable. On the second night, as the wind howled its worst, he finally spoke. "You care more about those mirrors than you've ever cared about this family." The accusation hung in the air, sharper than any ice crystal. Elizabeth did not answer. She was too busy measuring the angle of the cracked looking-glass, calculating whether the reflected beam could still be useful if she tilted it another degree northwest. She had no room for a fight. Every ounce of her attention belonged to the light. Then, on the third morning, the wind dropped. Silence returned, heavy and strange. The storm had passed, but the world outside was a blank white void. The snow had drifted halfway up the single window, burying the cabin in a cocoon of white. And inside that cocoon, something remarkable had happened. The ambient light, reflected off the endless snow outside, poured through the south window with an intensity Elizabeth had never seen. The mirrors, cracked but intact, caught that flood and multiplied it. The entire room glowed as if under a summer sky. The tomato vines, deprived of direct sun for 2 days, responded by opening new blossoms. The peppers set tiny fruit overnight. Henry stood speechless. Then he grabbed his camera. The first plate he exposed that morning was the sharpest he had ever produced in winter, lit not by harsh sunbeams but by a soft, omnidirectional radiance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The blizzard had not broken them. It had made the studio better. The snow was acting as a giant natural reflector, bouncing light into the room from every angle. Elizabeth had engineered a system for sunny days, but she had accidentally built one that thrived even during the aftermath of a storm. The worst winter had thrown at them had become their greatest asset. That photograph, a portrait of Elizabeth holding a ripe tomato beneath a blooming vine, her expression calm and unsurprised, would become famous in the settlement. Henry printed 3 copies. One he kept. One he gave to her. The third he sent by freight wagon to a newspaper office in Sioux Falls with a note, "February fruit in Dakota Territory." The editor, a man starved for anything that wasn't news of blizzards and cattle deaths, printed it on the front page. The headline read, "Woman Grows Summer in Winter." Within a month, letters began arriving from as far away as Chicago. People wanted to know her method. They wanted seeds. They wanted portraits taken in that strange, luminous cabin. But the fame brought danger too. Margaret Hargrave, who had once mocked the Hall of Mirrors, now spread a new rumor that Elizabeth was charging people for stolen sunlight, that she had somehow bewitched a photographer, that the money she was making belonged to her husband by law and by God's order. The settlement split. Some defended her. Others, especially those who had failed crops or sick children, whispered that she had made a pact with something unnatural. Thomas listened to all of it, and the poison took root deeper. One evening, while Henry was packing plates for a trip to the county seat, Thomas barred the door. He stood with his back against the frame, and in a low, dangerous voice, he demanded that the metal box of profits be turned over to him. "I'm the man of this claim," he said. "The law says so. Every cent you've made is mine." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached under the floorboard, retrieved the box, and set it on the table. "Take it," she said, "but know this, I will make more. The mirrors are mine, the plants are mine, and I will not stop." Thomas took the box, but he did not open it. He simply held it, staring at her as if seeing a stranger. That night, he slept in the lean-to. He never slept in the main cabin again. The partnership between Elizabeth and Henry became not just a business, but a quiet defiance. They began teaching other women how to build their own mirror walls. The tomato seeds, saved and shared, spread from homestead to homestead. By the time the first real thaw arrived in late March, the settlement had 3 more mirror gardens, smaller, cruder, but working. Elizabeth's cabin had become a destination. And the profits from the portraits had grown so reliable that Henry decided to stay through the spring. Building a permanent studio addition onto the south wall, he and Elizabeth designed together. A room made mostly of salvaged windows and angled mirrors, dedicated to trapping light year-round. The final turning point came when a county official arrived to assess the claim for tax purposes. He had heard of the glasshouse woman and wanted to see the property. When he stepped inside and saw the vines, the peppers, the flowering cucumbers, he blinked several times, then asked if he could have a portrait taken with a tomato in his hand. He paid in silver coin, and as he left, he told Elizabeth that her improvements had likely increased the claim's value threefold. "The law may not yet have a word for what you've built," he said, "but the land market does. You've made this piece of prairie worth something." That night, Elizabeth stood alone in the cabin after Henry had gone to his new studio room and Buttons had curled up by the stove. She looked at the cracked mirror still hanging on the wall, the original oval glass, the one she had brought from Ohio. The fracture now ran through its center like a vein, but the silver behind it still caught the faint moonlight filtering through the window. She remembered her father's glass house, the smell of oranges, the warmth. She had built more than a copy of that memory. She had built a machine that turned winter into a season of growth, and in doing so, had planted something that would outlast her. But the question that would define the rest of her life had not yet been answered. Could a woman in this territory own what her mind had created? Or would the world, and the law, and the man she still technically belonged to, eventually take it all away? The answer would arrive with the spring, alongside the first wagons of settlers who had read the newspaper article and were coming not for land, but for her. Spring came to the northern plains in fits and starts that year, a slow unfurling of mud and pale sunlight that finally cracked the ice from the wagon ruts in early April. The snow retreated layer by layer, revealing the brown prairie grass beneath, and for the first time in months, The south window of Elizabeth Cole's cabin did not need a wool blanket pressed against its sash. The mirror wall stood intact, cracked, patched in places with twine and bent nails, but still throwing its doubled light across the room where tomato vines now climbed past the windowsill and pepper plants had set fruit so heavy the branches drooped. The winter garden had not merely survived. It had produced more food than the household could eat, and the excess had been traded or gifted to half a dozen neighboring families. The first settlers drawn by the newspaper article arrived in a prairie schooner with a broken axle, a young couple named the Whitfields who had abandoned a failed claim near Yankton. They came knocking not for land but for Elizabeth herself, or rather, for her method. The wife, a thin woman with wind-chapped hands, had read the headline, "Woman Grows Summer in Winter," aloud to her husband 3 times before they decided to sell their plow and seek out the glasshouse woman. Elizabeth received them on the porch, the caramel dog Buttons lounging at her feet, and within an hour she was walking them through the angles of the mirrors, showing how the frosted glass diffuser softened the harshest beams, explaining how the south-facing window, the reflective wall, and the plant crates formed a triangle that trapped warmth the way a hollow in a hill traps afternoon sun. She never used the word inventor. She simply showed them what she had done. Henry Cole, now a permanent fixture in the studio addition, continued to profit from the winter portrait trade, but his role had expanded. He became a kind of chronicler, documenting the mirror gardens that began to sprout across the settlement. He photographed Elizabeth's cabin from 40 paces away during a bright March morning, the south window blazing like a square of hot silver, and that image, the cabin with its reflected light signature, ran in the Sioux Falls paper a second time. The caption read, "The brightest house in Dakota." Letters arrived from agricultural societies, from horticulturalists in Chicago, from a professor at the University of Minnesota who wanted to study the angles of incidence and the diffusion of winter sunlight. Elizabeth could not answer them all. She had never learned to write more than her name. So Henry wrote the letters for her, just as she had once taught him how to read the frost on a leaf. But the resolution of the photograph could not paper over the fracture in the household. Thomas had taken the metal box of profits that night, but in the weeks that followed, he made no move to leave. He simply stayed in the lean-to, eating the food Elizabeth prepared and watching the parade of visitors with a silence that had turned from sullen to dangerous. He had spent the money on whiskey and a second-hand rifle, and by mid-April he was drinking heavily during the daylight hours. One afternoon, while Elizabeth was showing the Whitfields how to plant cucumber seeds in salvaged crates, Thomas emerged from the lean-to with the rifle cradled across his arm. He did not point it at anyone. He simply stood there, letting the weight of the weapon speak. The Whitfields went pale. Elizabeth did not flinch. She turned to him and said, in a voice so quiet the others barely heard it, "Put that away, Thomas. There's nothing here for you but grief." He stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked north toward the empty prairie, and no one in the settlement saw him again. The official separation occurred without a lawyer, for the nearest courthouse was a 3-day ride and neither of them had the money to pay a barrister. A traveling circuit judge, hearing of the matter during his spring rounds, stopped at the cabin and interviewed Elizabeth alone. She showed him the improvements, the mirror wall, the studio addition, the crates of winter vegetables, the record book where Henry had carefully noted every portrait sold and every seed traded. The judge, a weathered man who had seen more than one claim fall apart over disputes between husband and wife, asked only one question. "Did he help you build this?" Elizabeth shook her head. "He only tried to stop me." The judge made a note in his ledger, and from that day forward the claim was legally hers to manage, though the word divorce was never spoken aloud. Frontier justice did not always need the right vocabulary to find the right outcome. With Thomas gone, the cabin's rhythm changed. The tension that had pressed against the walls for years lifted like a fog burning off. Henry moved his dark tent into the main room and built proper shelving for the glass plates. Elizabeth expanded the plant crates into 2 more rows, training cucumber vines along strings strung from the ceiling beams. Buttons, the dog, grew fat on kitchen scraps and appointed himself guardian of the mirror wall, sleeping each night in the warmest spot of reflected moonlight. The settlement, which had once whispered that Elizabeth was a foolish woman chasing vanity, now called her the Mirror Gardener, and the name was spoken with respect. Then came the second twist, the one nobody expected. Late that summer, when the outdoor gardens were finally heavy with beans and squash, and the need for the mirror wall had faded, a stranger staggered into the settlement from the north. He was a trapper, half-starved, his boots worn through, his eyes hollow with the look of a man who had seen too many empty miles. He had been lost for 11 days in the Badlands after a sudden fog disoriented his party. He had no map, no food, no hope, until one evening just as the sun was setting, he caught a flash of light on the southern horizon, a sharp, focused gleam like a signal mirror. He followed it for 2 days, and it did not move, and it did not dim, and it led him to the very cabin where Elizabeth Cole was now boiling tea for him over the stove. The mirror wall, aimed to catch and multiply sunlight, had also been sending a beam outward across the prairie. The same doubled light that grew tomatoes in February had become a beacon visible for miles on clear days, a kind of accidental lighthouse on a treeless sea. Henry, ever the documentarian, photographed the trapper on the porch with buttons, then made a careful calculation. He walked the line of sight from the cabin to the northern ridge, measuring the angle of the mirrors and noting how the beam's intensity shifted with the time of day. He discovered that the mirror wall, purely by chance, was oriented almost perfectly along a north-south axis that aligned with the most likely approach from the Badlands. A lost traveler coming from that direction would see the flash as a steady white star on the horizon. Word of the rescue spread faster than any article could travel. Families began leaving a candle in their windows at night as a marker, but none had the range of Elizabeth's concentrated reflection. Over the next 2 winters, at least 6 other lost souls, 2 trappers, a mail carrier, a family of German immigrants whose wagon had broken through ice, found their way to the cabin by following the beam. Each time, Elizabeth would see them stumbling across the snow and step onto the porch, wrapped in her shawl, with buttons barking and hot broth waiting. She had built more than a garden. She had, without ever intending it, built a lighthouse for the prairie. The county official, returning the following spring for a tax assessment, stared at the new plaque Henry had nailed above the door, a crude wooden board painted with the words Lighthouse in white lettering. He laughed once, a short bark of disbelief, then shook his head. "I've seen claims fail because of too little water, too much wind, too many rocks," he said. "I've never seen one rise because of too much light." Elizabeth did not amend him. She simply invited him inside for a cup of tea, and when he left he carried with him a packet of tomato seeds wrapped in brown paper, a gift he would plant in his own garden back east. The mirror wall stood for another 30 years. Elizabeth Cole lived in that cabin until she was an old woman, her hair the color of winter straw, her hands still adjusting the angles of the looking glasses each spring and fall as the sun's path shifted. Henry Cole, who bore no family relation but had become something closer than a partner, stayed until his own death a decade later, his last photograph being a portrait of Elizabeth, seated beside her most productive tomato vine, the cracked oval mirror visible in the background like a family heirloom. The studio edition became a real photography parlor, drawing customers from 3 counties. The profits, such as they were split fairly between them, and after Henry's passing, Elizabeth continued to manage the business on her own, hearing the Whitfield's eldest son to run the camera. Winter after winter, the tomatoes fruited in February, the portraits remained sharp, and the beam still shot outward across the snow, guiding the lost home. When Elizabeth finally passed away, the settlement held a funeral that was half mourning and half celebration. The minister, a circuit preacher who had once been skeptical of the mirror magic, preached a sermon about light and life and the stubbornness of a woman who had refused to let winter win. The cracked oval mirror, the one she had brought from Ohio, was given to the Whitfield family, who promised to keep it shining. In the years that followed, the mirror garden technique spread across the territory. Agricultural extension pamphlets published in the 1890s included diagrams of the Cole method, complete with recommended angles for different latitudes, and a note about the frosted glass diffuser. The little cabin on the south-facing slope was no longer a curiosity. It was the origin point of a practice that hundreds of families adopted, and the beacon effect, originally an accident, was studied by civil engineers considering early fire lookout towers. The woman who had once been laughed at for her hall of vanity had, against all odds, bent the rules of a harsh climate to her will, and in doing so had saved countless lives she never even met. But the core question that had haunted the first winter remained. Not whether the mirrors worked. They did beautifully. Not whether the tomatoes would fruit in February. They still do, in greenhouses and sunrooms around the world where her ideas have been adopted without her name. The real question was whether the world would ever fully understand what it meant, in that raw and unforgiving place, to take the only resource that winter could not freeze, the thin winter sun, and multiply it until it became something else entirely: food, income, sanctuary, and in its most surprising form, a light for the lost. The mirror wall was never meant to be a beacon. But then again, neither was Elizabeth Cole. What Elizabeth Cole accomplished in that raw cabin was never about mirrors or tomatoes alone. It was about the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept that winter must be a season of surrender. The same frozen months that drove men to despair and emptied root cellars across the plains, she transformed into a time of growth, of profit, of unexpected community. And she did it not with wealth or influence, but with the broken discards others had thrown away: a cracked looking-glass, a piece of frosted lantern, a few seeds wrapped in brown paper. Her story challenges something we've always believed about the frontier. We've been told it was won by muscle, by the brute strength of men who broke the land with plows and fences. But survival on the northern plains was rarely just about who was strongest. It was often about who was most willing to study the world as it actually was, rather than as they wished it to be. Elizabeth Cole had no power to stop the winter. So instead, she studied the sun's path across her floor, measured the angles of each pale beam, and built an architecture of multiplied light that asked nothing of the frozen earth but gave her tomatoes in February, portraits that sustained her income, and a beacon that saved the lives of strangers. And here's what lingers. The mirror wall was laughed at, then feared, then quietly copied until the Cole method was printed in agricultural pamphlets without her name attached. That is the fate of so many innovations born far from the centers of power. The settlement eventually forgot the woman who hung the first glass, even as their gardens thrived on stolen principles. But the light itself never forgot. It kept shining outward across the prairie, an accidental lighthouse built by someone who simply refused to stop observing, adjusting, and refusing to believe the world's rules were fixed. So the question that remains is not just about Elizabeth Cole. It's about you. When the long winter of your own life arrives, when resources are thin, when others laugh, when every reasonable voice tells you to hunker down and wait for spring, will you be content to survive it? Or will you start studying the light, experimenting with angles, and building something so improbable that the same season meant to bury you becomes the very thing that shelters everyone around you? Elizabeth Cole didn't beat the winter. She understood it deeply enough to let it become her partner. And that, in the end, is a far more dangerous and hopeful idea than simply winning. If you believe stories like hers still matter, the forgotten visionaries, the stubborn inventors, the ordinary people who rewrote what was possible, then subscribe now. There are more winters to explore, more lost beacons to uncover, and more quiet rebels whose legacies still shape the world in ways we've barely begun to understand.